My great pleasure to introduce Ayse Caglar. She's been a university professor at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Vienna since 2011. Before, she was a professor at the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Central European University in Budapest. And she's been a Minerva Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Ethnic and Religious Diversity. Among her fields of interest are globalization, urban restructuring, migration, transnationalization processes in the state, citizenship, Roma in Europe, and processes of dispossession and displacement. A wide range of topics, and over the years, she's been the author of numerous publications on these topics, which I see as crucial to migration studies. Those that stand out for me that I've used in my teaching have covered from moving, quote, beyond the ethnic lens and theorizing city scale, along with looking at migrant pathways of economic emplacement. Her most recent book, co-authored with Nina Glickschiller, will be published by Duke University next month, Migrants and City Making, Dispossession, Displacement, and Urban Regeneration. I've just read one of her newest chapters, Chronotopes of Migration Scholarship, Challenges of Contemporaneity and Historical Conjuncture, in the edited volume Migration and Temporality. And actually her very latest work is looking at the political economy of diversity in deindustrialized cities, looking at migrants as scale makers. It's my great pleasure to introduce this scholar.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm close enough to the microphone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for giving me the possibility to share my work with you. And I think the whole program looked very interesting to me, and then it started very interestingly. I hope to come up with the start, the bar that the start established. And I'm very happy that actually I am talking after Nick, because there are a couple of issues that I think my talk converses, but from a very different perspective, not contradictory, but picking up from different ends. My work is on the relationship between migrants and city making. That is how migrants participate in the processes and struggles that make and remake their cities. So I focus on the interrelations between the production of urban space and the migrants and migration. So I will address the questions that you had posed us in terms of transnational migration and justice from this perspective. So you have to bear with me that this is the area that I am familiar with. I would like to start my talk with an assertion that methodological nationalism and its less ethnic lands are entrenched in migration and to a large extent in urban scholarship, that they hinder us exploring today's movements and struggles of social, economic, and historical justice in their complexity. In this, I see transnational migration scholarship as not being an exception. By methodological nationalism in migration scholarship, I think I don't have to go into details, but I'm just referring to the reification of the nation state as the self-evident container of political, cultural, and economic relations, where the related ethnic lands, which often holds also a grip on transnational migration scholarship, obscures the diversity of migrants' relationships to their settlement, to other localities around the world, as well as, and this is very important for me, the commonalities between migrants and non-migrant populations. Though methodological nationalism manifests itself in several ways, it is entrenched in migration and urban studies in terms of their units of analysis. I will argue that the deeply engraved methodological nationalism does not only have impediments in migration scholarship and policy. So my concern is not only in terms of what it does in terms of our analysis and the policies, but I think it also wails, or both of them, I mean, ethnic class is part of the methodological nationalism. They all wail the complex solidarities of urban residents, migrant and non-migrant alike, for social economic justice movements. My argument is very simple. In order to move beyond the grip of methodological nationalism, I argue that we need a new analytical vocabulary that will go beyond the binaries between migrants and those who are considered to be non-migrants, so that we could capture the independencies between the processes underlying urban redevelopment that often remain veiled in studies on the relationship between migrants and cities. So it is actually also a plea for a critical analytical engagement with the vocabularies that we are dealing with. And also I will argue that, following with our upcoming book, that the disempowered cities might provide a suitable entry point to see these dynamics between migrants and city making, where we could see the fault lines of urban restructuring and neoliberal urban politics and their contradictions in a better way. So I would like to start by underlining two fault lines of the scholarship and policies on the relationship between migrants and cities. First, accept a few studies that focus on migrants' lives and social relations in cities that are not global centers of economic, political, and cultural power. The scholarship on the relationship between cities and their migrants mostly concentrate on metropoles and gateway cities, and I think this is also very much engraved in methodological nationalism, where that the state territoriality is assumed to have been continuous and homogeneity. So we need to counter this this tendency of mass migration and policy studies, which generate theory and policies from the particular experiences of metropoles or gateway cities, ignoring the different dynamics of migrant settlement in cities of varying scale and power, especially in the context of uneven territoriality of neoliberalism. This bias of cities of power become even more problematic. So it is in terms of generating the theories on the basis of research of particularity of cities with global, global power, or cities of global powerhouse, then we are actually might be missing certain other dynamics which might be more visible in other places. Second, urban redevelopment narratives mask the underlying processes of urban regeneration and the growing inequalities in cities. This is a very crucial part, I think. Despite policies and scholarship that portray cities as engines of development generating wealth and new forms of governance and power in ways that would benefit the vast majority of urban residents, these urban growth narratives, which are often celebrated within the quote-unquote urban turn, mask growing inequalities within and between cities. They fail to acknowledge the displacements, dispossessions, and contestations underlying urban restructuring. That there is an urgent need to address these interrelated processes of wealth generation, through urban redevelopment, increasing disparities, and the migrant settlement together. On the basis of these 12 lines of research on migrants and cities, in our book, we called for two things. One, we said that we have to focus on what we called as the disempowered cities, and then a new analytical vocabulary. But let me first focus on the disempowered cities. We called for a focus on the relationship between migrant dynamics and urban restructuring in cities of varying scale, and particularly in cities that lack adequate economic, political, and cultural power. Among such cities that experience restructuring processes from within a more structurally disadvantaged position than those identified as quote-unquote global cities. We focus on those disempowered cities which are marked by decimated economies. They are marked by loss of population, loss of tax base, and above all, loss of economic, political, and cultural power. However, having said that, these are not simply powerless cities. These are the cities which they had power and lost their power. So if you look at them, they are disempowered in terms of their access to national power, capital, investments, and global talent, but which they used to have it. So if you look at them, they are mostly former industrial hubs, industrialized cities, and Rust Belt cities. And I think this has a very important consequences in terms of where we see the politics going and today's populist movements going. So, and we argue that actually there is a utility in focusing on disempowered cities. As I said, that there are cities with limited resources available for their residents. We explicating their relationship between cities and their migrants in disempowered cities. My argue is that might be particularly important for migration scholars and policymakers, first because in cities of this kind of limited power, the multiple ways migrants contribute to the multifaceted aspects of city making can be more readily studied. Although migrants' multiple ways of emplacement, pathways of emplacement are visible in other kinds of cities, studying them in cities of limited resources might provide new insights into the different opportunities that emerge in these places of for migrant emplacement, as well as new insights into the dynamics and above all contradictions and effects of dispossessions and displacements underlying urban redevelopment. Within the cities with limited resources, all these processes have very augmented effects. And that we could see those fault lines, those contradictions in a better way. The contradictions of these contradictions become more visible in these disempowered cities. So we also called for a new analytical vocabulary that would enable us to capture how city residents, why do we need an analytical vocabulary? We said that we need an analytical vocabulary like that to engage critically, to capture how city residents participate in the processes and struggles to remake their cities, not simply as unskilled or skilled labor force, more, and then to approach the urban inequalities and disparities in relation to the dispossessive processes and displacements underlying wealth generation through urban redevelopment. This is wealth generation through urban redevelopment entails these processes, but these are very often veiled as urban growth. Third, to capture the to capture the interdependencies among these processes, as well as, and this I underline, the common conditions of precarity and displacement which mark the lives of many urban residents, migrant as well as non-migrant. That is why this kind of this is in search of a vocabulary where we could capture the common conditions of precarity, which the categories migrant and non-migrant actually disassociate, which are often glossed over by urban development and urban turn narratives. So, what are the building blocks of this conceptual network? First, by using displacement, and I'm using displacement as an analytical tactic as Saskia Sassen uses, that to shed light on something which is within our framework usually remains veiled. So we try to make series of interrelated processes which are obscured by the concept of mobility visible. So the displacement, instead of the concept of mobility, the argument is that if we use displacement, we might be shedding light on different kinds of relationships. The concept of mobility fails to draw attention to the importance of looking at the interrelations between displacement, dispossession, and accumulation underlying migration. The concept of displacement might enable us to draw attention on those entangled processes and see how seemingly independent processes and locations, as well as institutions, are ultimately connected with each other. So it enables us the dynamics to elsewhere, where the concept of mobility in a way rips it out, because we focus more on that process or that action. So this is built upon a relational understanding of quote-unquote locality. As the critical scholars, why I am making a kind of so much noise around mobility, we know that, of course there is a merit in it, but mobility is a slippery concept in analyzing migration and migrants' relations to city making. The nation state, as the critical scholars of mobility show, that the nation state occupies a central role in defining and institutionalizing what counts as mobility and what kinds of mobilities are rendered invisible. Not every mobile person is designated as a migrant, and there are many people designated as migrants who had not moved from anywhere to anywhere, third generation, fourth generation. And usually the global talent is not captured as under the mobility. Like the concept of displacement, we underline another concept as emplacement as central to the analytical framework we are proposing. We define emplacement as the relationship between the continuing restructuring of place within multiscalar networks of power and the person's efforts within the barriers and opportunities that contingencies of local placemaking offer to build a life within networks of local, national, supranational, and global interactions. It is a processual concept which allows us to situate all residents of a city within transformations of space over time by linking space, place, and power. So it is not, emplacement is not only for migrants. everyone has to be emplaced within the constraints and then the opportunities given by the broader forces in the historical conjuncture. And displacement and emplacement are interrelated processes of restructuring of space and social relations at particular points in time. The concern with the choice of the vocabulary is to connect the categories which have been separated and connect to broader dynamics. Unlike the terms of integration or assimilation, this, as I said, the concept of emplacement both invokes a sense of placemaking and allows us to focus on a set of experiences shared by people who are generally differentiated by scholars and policymakers as either migrants or native. If you remember that my concern was trying to shed light on the domains of common conditions of precarity, domains of commonality, this also concept of emplacement enables us to look at the experiences shared by people who are generally differentiated into different categories. So, by speaking of emplacement, we can situate migrant and non-migrant displacements. Displacement is also not in the monopoly of migrants. Displacement is a process in the urban restructuring that I'm talking about, that it addresses everyone actually, all the urban residents. So it enables us to locate these processes temporarily within the neoliberal processes of the destruction and reconstitution of capital. And this analytical vocabulary, this search, this need, comes also with a need trying to move beyond binaries. This conceptual network, I think, that enables us to move beyond binaries dominating migration, including transnational scholarship, migration scholarship. It enables us to approach the dynamics of migrants and those who see themselves as natives in city making within the same analytical framework, so that we could address common conditions of precarity and displacement many urban residents are subject to. By situating migrants as contemporaries of all other urban residents, that is to say, being subject to the configuration of social forces, the current social forces active there, despite unequal access to power networks, that being subject to this, looking at them subject to those social forces rather than cultural and ethnic dynamics of power, and by analyzing their practices as coeval to each other. The article Nadia was kindly referring to was also actually arguing for about moving out of this non-synchronity of the migrants and non-migrants. And I think these are the kind of the binaries which are also coming from the methodological nationalism. So if we look at it that way, the effort is to look at it as contemporaries of each other. It becomes clear that all city inhabitants, migrant or not, build their lives within processes of displacement and emplacement that are enabled and shaped by power geometry at that historical conjuncture. So not inscribing the sources of dynamics and sources of their references to the migrants, sources of references, not to other times and other places. We know that this is how that the colonial processes of making subjects work very well. Anthropologists know that, I think. So I think here I have to make it clear what the broader context of this strategies and policies of urban redevelopment is. I'm not talking about all city making from the 6th century onwards. I'm really looking at a particular kind of a context. Here it is important to note that the broader context of city leaders' strategies and policies of seeking accumulation by revitalizing the city is neoliberal globalization. This is a context which cities came to play prominent roles as strategic nodes of capital flow and units of governance with powers of taxation and local development. This is the context in which cities increasingly unleash themselves as engines of economy, centers of trade, investment and innovation from the federal and national state, and this unleashing related with the restructuring of capital. It is connected to the restructuring of capital, is part of the changing configuration of state and local power. These dynamics alter the value regimes in cities. All urban resources acquire a new value within the city's competition to reach out. Global, regional, state, non-state and supranational institutions, and of course their funds and power to attract capital investments to the city for generation of wealth. That is the city's, the main concern is that they have to generate wealth and to attract capital, and for that there is a kind of this alters the value regimes in the cities. Different segments of cities' population, places, practices, built environment, histories acquire value once they become assets for capital accumulation through urban regeneration. You could look at it in terms of how cities invent their histories, they become in terms of their heritages, or in terms of certain minorities might be discovered in that way too. But I'm just looking at it as value regimes that are being changed, altered through the restructuring of capital, restructuring of the city in relation to the restructuring of the capital. Faced with these challenges, city leaders of disempowered cities also revisit their cities' resources. This is the game in town. All the cities are trying to do that. But disempowered cities have very limited resources, and migrants, refugees, and minorities often become surprisingly valorized in these processes. This is where we locate the migrant-friendly narratives by city leaders. Actually, this research started with a kind of a surprise where these kind of Rust Belt cities, and Miraftat also had written on terms of in the global heartlands, in the Rust Belt cities or in disempowered kind of the cities, the city leaders were had those kind of very migrant-friendly narratives. This was at the turn of the 2000s, but that continued, and still there are, despite all those issues with the quote-unquote refugee crisis. And I think we need a caveat for the regimes of value. I have dealt elsewhere with the striking change in the value of an extremely marginalized and long persecuted minority group, namely Syriac Christians, in a border city between Syria and Turkey in Mardin. I situated, these were the people who were subject to genocide together with the Armenians in 1915. And in 2000, starting the beginning of the 2000, they acquired a kind of a value in the city. These are the people who were killed or had to flee their lives. So I situated their revaluation processes, including their prominence in the cultural, religious, linguistic diversity narratives in Mardin, within an analysis of the city's repositioning struggle in networks of power to attract capital for wealth generation. Here I draw on studies on regimes of value that show revaluation is connected to global movement of capital accumulation and its temporalities. I argue for approaching these devaluation and valorization processes of different groups in relation to broader processes of value creation and capital accumulation in play at that place. Second, situating this process of revaluation within the changing power geometry of a historical conjuncture. So it is related with the creation of value through wealth accumulation, accumulation of capital, but of course it is not a kind of a capital controls everything. It is within a kind of a power geometry of a historical conjuncture. And I think I was able to show that this group that was also who was the group that was desired and acquired value after the change of the historical conjuncture in 2015 in relation to the regional dynamics and deepening of the Syrian war and Turkey's politics, actually they had to flee again. So here it is important to note that, and actually this goes very much in line with what Nick was talking about, that capital is always a social relation. Relations of capital are social relations constituted within fields of power. Those who understand capital also to be a set of unequal social relations repeatedly underline the legitimizing narratives of racialized, culturalized, and gendered differences. That is to say, the coloniality of power as being fundamental to appropriations and the dispossessive processes underlying capital accumulation. Actually, Nick had shown very well how that racialization works for the creation of a particular vulnerable labor force or deportable, kind of all multiple vulnerabilities in terms of for capital. We know this from the racialized discourses intrinsic to slavery and different forms of dispossessed labor. However, once these constructed differences take the form of a positive valuation, as it is the case in the narratives of diversity, multiculturalism, and communitarian politics, these valorizations are often approached as if they were detached from the structures and processes of dispossessions underlying capital accumulation. I'm trying to show that actually both processes go together. Building upon this understanding of capital, I approach the striking valorization of different groups and their concomitant empowerment as part of capital and urban restructuring geared to establishing the competitive worth of the place within the context of uneven spatial globalization. So consequently, I call for situating both the devalorization and valorization processes vis-à-vis marginalized groups, including their persecution, displacement, dispossession, as well as their acquisition of prominence as assets of linguistic and religious diversity within a common analytical lens. That is my major concern. In my work, I showed how the culturalized, as I said, racialized logics were part of both the processes of devaluation and later revaluing that affected the capital accumulation in Mardin. By the devaluation, by dehumanization of this group, the land was appropriated, confiscated, and they were part of that kind of a capital accumulation. That was the period of the genocide. And then exactly the same qualities were brought in to devalue within the narratives of diversity. These revaluing processes of Syriac Christians were into a multiscalar field with, later on, powerful supranational and global, as well as national regional actors, such as EU has been particularly very present in the making of the religious and linguistic differences and as a value, as part of their cultural and religious rights regime. So it was actually the kind of the same process to attract capital. However, the changing configurations, when I'm talking about changing configuration, I'm talking about the mix and potency of intersecting networks of disparate power, that the historical conjuncture played an important role in it, so that actually, what I'm saying is that the value is not in the group, and the value actually the racializations and the revalorizations, because we see that kind of revalorizations also for in terms of migrants, and then the changing also deservedness and undeservingness of the migrants, and also the migrant industries, especially in cultural industries. We see that we see the same processes. So this is the broader context of urban the importance of attracting capital and investment to the city, that those context of the migrant-friendly narratives of these welcoming cities are closely, when we looked at it, then those narratives, they were closely enmeshed with business and investment-friendly narratives. This proved to be crucial in disempowered cities. As our research showed, despite different regional histories, demographic composition, and different institutional and discursive resources available for economic and urban development in the cities we focused on 3 cities, Halle an der Saale in former East Germany, Manchester, New Hampshire, and Martin. So they're in very different kinds of, they're located in very different nation states, have very different histories in terms of migration and city making. But what was interesting was, that these, in all those cities, we were struck by the migrant-friendly narratives, but these migrant-friendly narratives were very much enmeshed with business-friendly and investment-friendly narratives. They were using, actually, migrants came to the fore as for the important assets to the desired economic growth and prosperity of their cities. In these cities, the revitalization of the city centers and the presence of migrants, refugees became also important to perform the safe, open, and business-friendly environment of the city. If you wish, a kind of the cosmopolitan aura of the city to attract, of course, the foreign capital or multinational capital. So this was very important to attract not only the multinational but domestic capital to those cities, because these were the cities they had to fight with their negative images of racist, dangerous, shrinking, and declining. So remember, these are the disempowered cities which had gone through deindustrialization, and they were identified as racist or poverty-ridden and shrinking and dangerous cities. The following similarities emerged among these seemingly disparate cities. We found that while migrant-friendly narratives did not develop into migrant-specific policies with clear budgeting funding in these cities, the business investment-friendly narratives indeed developed into a plethora of programs and incentives to attract capital and investment. So there was a kind of, if you want to use it to, if you want me to shift to the kind of the language, there is a kind of a spectacle of foreign-friendly, migrant-friendly kind of narratives, but there were no kind of programs. Nothing was done for these people. But on the other hand, together with that openness and migrant-friendly, foreign-friendly narratives, there were lots of programs that was for attracting capital. These included subsidies, tax rebates, abolishment of business and corporate taxes, provision of public resources, commons as treasury land to corporate capital below market prices. This we saw in all those 3 cities. The city regeneration in disempowered cities was shaped by a dependence on public funding, which was very weak in these cities to start with. So these cities attracted some corporate and private investors and multinational investments. However, public revenue streams of these cities did not increase. They attracted the capital, but the cities, on the contrary, these, after all 10, 15 years of urban regeneration projects, these cities were left with even fewer resources for public services. In fact, all these cities, the city debt increased after a decade of urban projects of economic growth, and despite attraction of capital. In all of these 3 cities, disparities and poverty increased, dispossessions and displacements intensified. So, these dynamics, actually, this combination led to 2 contradictory but simultaneous developments, providing opportunities but also challenges to migrant emplacement in all 3 cities, and for us, understanding the dynamics of the polarized political field in these places in their complexity. First, in a context where the revenues decreased, public resources eroded, public services failed, and disparities and debt increased, the peculiar combination of this foreign, migrant-friendly narratives with the business, capital, foreign, multinational-friendly narratives in urban redevelopment paved the ground for increased racism. Migrants are increasingly they were like a spectacle. They were up there in all sorts of narratives there. But actually, what people were experiencing was impoverishment and erosion of public resources. So the migrants became the scapegoat of the effects of dispossessive dynamics of capital accumulation and of draining public resources for the provision of public services to all city residents. They became the scapegoat of the increased impoverishment. So, I mean, at one point you are waving a flag of migrants and refugees, or in terms of diversity narratives at one point. On the other hand, these are the places that actually they are continuously impoverished. On the other end, that established a kind of a basis for the kind of anti-migrant, racist and populist movements. On the other hand, the disempoweredness of these cities ironically provided also opportunities for migrants and refugees to establish domains of commonality with the dispossessed and displaced city residents. In the context of eroded public coffers, there were no, and there was one important part of that, why that happened, was that there were no city resources invested in provisioning of migrant services, I said, and there was not kind of a willingness for that, let alone religious and ethnic community-based services. So this lack of resources and programs for the institutionalization of differences, ethnic and religious differences, opened opportunities for migrants, refugees, and the quote-unquote natives to build sociabilities based on domains of commonality and to be active in local politics as well as within urban social movements. The domains of commonality established over differences became more visible in these disempowered cities than in more powerful resource cities. It is noteworthy that actually in those 3 cities that what we found was that, so I'm saying that there is a polarized politics. I'm not saying that in these cities there is no racism. There is populism and there is increasing racism, but there's something else too. And with this something else, we could see it in disempowered cities maybe in a better way. It is noteworthy that in Germany, one of the very first 2 black German members of parliament who initially arrived as a refugee was in Halle, not in Frankfurt or in Berlin. Halle provided the opportunity actually to become that prominent in the local politics. Manchester, not New York, or Los Angeles, elected the second Muslim citizen to a US state legislature, and the very first elected Syrian Christian mayor in Turkey was in Mardin, not in Istanbul or in another city. And most importantly, none of these migrants were elected on the basis of black, ethnic, or religious communitarian politics and constituencies, but on politics of social and historical justice, challenging the increasing disparities in their respective cities. Actually, in Mardin, that was very, very striking because in the genocide, that is during the 1915 genocide, where Armenians and Syriac Christians were killed, actually Kurds were involved in the genocide and the killing the Syriac Christians. So there were the relations between those different groups have been very, very tense all through these processes. But for the first time, actually the co-mayor, that a Kurdish and a Syriac Christian became a co-mayor, and they became part of social justice solidarities and historical justice solidarities. So as I indicated at the beginning of my talk, constructing solidarities among city residents of diverse social, political, and economic backgrounds and legal statuses has been a major challenge to those aspiring to and imagining alternative visions of society and urban life. I put myself into that. That is my concern, actually. This perspective from disempowered cities provides scholars insights about the emerging domains of commonality that are not based on tolerance of difference, but build or bridging difference, because bridging difference in a way reproduces the difference, but built on the basis of shared affect, mutual respect, and aspirations by city dwellers, migrant and non-migrant alike. But that, the condition for that was the common conditions of precarity, actually, ironically. Thus, those categorized as migrants and non-migrants are situated within the same processes of displacement and search for emplacement, find domains of commonality that become the ground for their sociabilities. These establish the basis of the, if you wish, you could call solidarities of the dispossessed and then the displaced. These however, we were able to explore these solidarities only when we adopted a new analytical vocabulary and a perspective that broadened the spatial and temporal scales of ethnography. I think I will stop here. Thank you.